So most of you by now probably know the revelations by the French prosecutor earlier today about Germanwings 9525, the plane that went down in the French Alps. The co-pilot appears to have deliberately crashed the plane. The pilot went out of the cockpit, apparently to go to the bathroom. The co-pilot locked the cockpit door from the inside, then started to go into an 8-minute descent which led to the crash. The pilot on the outside of the cockpit door was at first knocking, then loudly banging, and then attempting to kick down the door to gain access to the cockpit. Couldn't, and then it appears that the co-pilot Andreas Lubitz deliberately crashed the plane into the mountain. No evidence that a medical condition caused him to collapse and the crash happened that way. His breathing was steady right until impact, according to the cockpit recordings. So this appears to be a deliberate act of both suicide and mass murder, given that there are 149 other victims aside from Lubitz himself. And this was typical of the reaction on Twitter. How come Andreas Lubitz is not branded a terrorist? Imagine he was of a Muslim background. Twitter would be in meltdown. And this is a common theme that we see on Twitter over the past hour or so, is people lashing out at the mainstream media for not immediately assuming that this is an act of terror, and they say that that's born out of racism. Here's a more incoherent example of this sentiment. Andreas Lubitz killed 148 people, and because he is not Islamic or dark-skinned, it is not terrorism. Bullshit. Stop it. He is worse than 9/11. Here's a somewhat more coherent version. How come Andreas Lubitz is not branded a terrorist, willingly creating fear which deliberately targeted civilians is an act of terrorism? And that is the theme on Twitter right now, amongst people who can't seem to grasp the definition of terrorism, which is the use of violence and threats to intimidate or coerce, especially for political purposes. But there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Andreas Lubitz had any kind of political agenda. If he was trying to make a political statement, then it makes complete sense that he would have voiced the purpose of why he was about to kill himself and 149 other people on the voice recordings from the cockpit. There's also no evidence that has emerged yet from his social media presence, from his company history, or his mental health history that he had any strong political leanings or grievances whatsoever. And then you look at the crash itself. Obviously this flight was travelling from Barcelona to Dusseldorf. If this was a terrorist attack, then why did he crash the plane in a remote location into the side of a mountain? Surely the very purpose of a terrorist attack is to create as much carnage, fear, alarm and atrocity as possible by crashing a plane into a building or into a major city. This flight path would have taken Lubitz and the aircraft past numerous major cities on its way from Barcelona to Dusseldorf. You have Marseille, Lyon, Geneva, Zurich, Frankfurt, Cologne, and Dusseldorf itself. But instead of choosing to target any of those major cities with huge populations, Lubitz crashed the plane into the side of a mountain in the remote French Alps. So that clearly suggests that his motive was not political, but that it was mass murder and suicide. But again, this logic isn't enough to satisfy some of the liberals on Twitter who think that it's racist not to describe this as a terrorist attack because Andreas Lubitz is white. They're saying that that's why the media is not describing it as terrorism, simply because he's white and he's not a Muslim. Well, no, they're not describing it as terrorism because there's no evidence to suggest it is terrorism. And there's a clear difference between terrorism, which is aimed at political coercion, and simply suicide or mass murder, which is what this appears to be. Another possible contradiction behind the narrative of this tragic crash is this story. 9/11 changes allowed French Alps crash. Of course, before 9/11, most of the cockpit doors in airliners were not locked. People could freely go in and out. Of course, the case in the Germanwings crash was that the pilot was locked out. He was frantically banging on the door, caving in the door, trying to get in. But the co-pilot, Lubitz, had locked him out. However, comments by the German transport minister this afternoon kind of contradict that, because he said that the pilot could have used a code to access the lock on the door. So there was no need to try and cave in the door, and that he wasn't actually locked out. He could have used a code to re-enter the cockpit. So there seems to be some confusion surrounding that issue. Lufthansa addressed this directly in a press conference this morning, saying that the captain entered a code to try to get back into the cockpit, but they don't know whether the co-pilot in the cockpit, Lubitz, had put the lever lock on, which would have prevented the captain from entering. Another interesting aspect is that the FAA recognised the co-pilot, Lubitz, as a prestigious FAA airman and listed them in their certification database for pilots who have met or exceeded the high educational licensing and medical standards established by the FAA. So it seemed that this 28-year-old pilot, who was relatively inexperienced, had already, in his short time training and becoming a pilot, received high commendation from organisations like the FAA. Which of course deepens the mystery as to why there were no signs, why nobody seemed to pick up on his mental state, which presumably led to this suicide mission. Now people are calling for harsher psychological testing of pilots before they fly planes. Of course, before these revelations by the French prosecutor, the conspiracy theorists who think that every single event ever is staged because of their own mental illness thought that this was linked to CERN and the Large Hadron Collider located in Geneva. Of course, the crash happened relatively close to Geneva. The first conspiracy theory was that the plane was brought down as a result of CERN. Don't ask me how that happened, how they've got the ability to bring down planes, but that was the initial conspiracy theory. And now, in light of these new revelations, they've changed tack to a different theory, which is that the plane was meant to crash into CERN, that it was hijacked by the co-pilot or by whoever to be crashed deliberately into CERN to create a massive catastrophe, and that it was shot down by a fighter jet to prevent that from happening. Of course, there's no evidence for any of that, but that's what some of the conspiracy theorists are claiming. So that's just about all the relevant details that have emerged so far. So let me know what you think in the comments below. This remains a huge mystery, although there's no concrete evidence that this was a terrorist attack. Of course, the question remains, what could possibly have been the motive of Andreas Lubitz to not only kill himself in such a spectacular way, but also take 149 innocent people with him? In the absence of any evidence of a political motive, one can only assume that this was some kind of bizarre, narcissistic personal statement, and that Lubitz wanted his suicide to make global headlines for years to come. But as of now, it remains a total mystery. Let me know what you think in the comments below. This is Paul Joseph Watson for Infowars.com.